The Ukrainians and the Europeans appear to be given a big middle finger to the White House and their increasingly friendly stance towards Russia. But is this really a shift in the Ukrainian and European stance, or is it just a roundabout way of doing more negotiations with Putin? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is pretty crazy. Ukraine and Europe have presented the United States with their own ceasefire and peace proposal. And it contains a couple of provisions that I actually think are tailored FUs, essentially, to the White House. And here is why I think that. First off, the document contains robust security guarantees, including from Washington, implying that U.S. troops are going to be involved in this peace plan. And at baseline, I think this is a message for the White House to say, listen, here's how it feels when other countries put up your troops for a mission that you yourself aren't willing to do. Now, the Europeans, again, are out here. You might recall the Trump peace proposal conveniently signs up the European armies to enforce a ceasefire, one that they have fundamental disagreements with the terms of. And so the Europeans likely are saying no you in this, right? But the document also includes no talks on territorial concessions until, quote, a full and unconditional ceasefire, land, air, and sea, has been implemented, right? So stop the fighting, then talk about territory. This is interesting because this was the U.S. stance like 2 months ago, but now has shifted into essentially Russia has said no, 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 and the U.S. has compromised while Russia's compromised on actually become less compromising. There's other key areas where the viewpoints diverge between Ukraine and Europe and the United States, right? This includes an Article 5-like agreement, not NATO membership for Ukraine. Again, that's something that the U.S. has already thrown out of the window. One of their best bargaining chips is currently, they've thrown into the dumpster before negotiations really have even started. And this Article 5-like agreement includes backing by the U.S. And, right, it contains no formal recognition of Russian territorial seizures, and the Europeans have a vested interest in this because, as you might recall, NATO members currently sit on Russia's border, including the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as in Finland. So a lot of those NATO countries are looking and saying, listen, if we normalize Russia invading countries and getting that territory recognized, it's going to create a new normal for Europe. And it's going to incentivize Vladimir Putin to use his now massive military to bully and invade these other countries. Remember, European militaries are have an active duty force of around a tenth of the size of the current Russian force. So even though Russia is ostensibly a smaller economy, their ability, the fact that they have a 3-year head start in a massive militarization campaign means that their ability, even not to invade the Baltics per se, but to simply build up a large military on the Baltic border, and then call up their leadership and say, hey, Latvia, it's time to make a deal, right? And as you might recall, in this administration, their stance is that when someone builds up a military on your border, as Russia did to Ukraine, that the only appropriate response is to negotiate with them. Now, you might notice that stance means that essentially you can coerce your neighbors to do whatever you want if you threaten them sufficiently. But that is apparently the norm the White House wants to establish in the global community now. But the fact that the Europeans put the opposite stance in there of no negotiations until we achieve a ceasefire. There's also, of course, sanctions on Russia can only be eased after a sustainable peace has been reached. This is in contrast to the White House considering implementing before a peace deal, just simply releasing Russian sanctions before any peace deal is agreed upon, which again, why would Russia even reach a peace deal if it's not clear what additional sticks are left in the U.S. arsenal, what additional chips are left in the negotiating block if the U.S. refuses Article 5, refuses entry to NATO, refuses additional military support to Ukraine, and refuses to like implement anything, really any other sanctions, you're out, right? There's nothing. What else is there to coerce Russia to do anything, right? Again, if Russia is the only person who achieves any objectives in this war, in this peace settlement, then it is fair to say that the U.S. will have granted Russia a victory. Now, again, this is in contrast to this European-Ukrainian deal that involves something that looks a little bit more tit for tat or fair. It includes, of course, the return of deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children. This is part of Putin's cultural really cultural genocide is the word we use here for this. Think of it as sort of the actual version of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. I'm totally going to get demonetized, in which Russian occupation forces have gutted not just the education systems in the occupied territories of anything to do with the Ukrainian national identity, but they've actually found children who have been orphaned or who are internally displaced and sent them into Russia to be adopted by Russian families, raised as Russian, and then likely repatriated to these regions, but with a instilled loyalty to the Russian state. And so this sort of, this is something that Ukraine is really said we cannot have. Ukrainian children need to be raised Ukrainian, right? No different than if, for example, China was to occupy, say, Hawaii and scoop out a bunch of American children and then raise them in China. We would say no, even though their parents might not be around, they still need to be imbued with, they still are U.S. citizens and they have a right to be raised in America. Now, the multiple diplomatic sources have told CNN that officials in Europe and Asia are bracing for the outcome of renewed U.S.-Russia talks, fearing that the U.S.-Russia's the plan currently sends a dangerous message. And as they point out, the Europeans are pointing out that if one country in Europe is forced to give up parts of its sovereign territory to a conqueror, that means that everyone else can as well, particularly if the guarantor of so much of the international security system, the United States, is the one who's raising their hand and saying, actually, if you invade your neighbor and you just refuse to negotiate long enough, we'll hand you what you've taken. You get to keep what you've conquered. And so if you're a large country or a country with designs on a weaker neighbor, you're going to say, man, it's a limited time only sale. We have 4 years where we can do this. Because remember, Trump has positioned himself as the peace president. But the problem is that justice and peace are diametrically opposed, right? You can end a boxing fight at any time by simply quitting, by giving your opponent the win. But of course, that sort of goes against but if you want to win, you have to fight. And this is sort of where you end up with, right? Where if you want peace, you can always just give the bully what they want. But at some point, the bully's going to demand more and more. And that's the fear that basically everyone has, including the Europeans, right? And even Keith Kellogg, who I've had grave concerns about his perspective and his peace proposals, even he's describing these talks as candid, positive, and productive. And European negotiators are saying that they, quote, managed to convince the Ukrainians to convince themselves to get in a more U.S. administration-friendly position. But I think this still reflects a level of naivete, that the U.S. position is something other than just explicitly pro-Russian, and that there is any kind of fairness. I don't actually think there is, because as we've pointed out, that the Russian stance has been almost impossible to pin down in this war. And it's continually moved. Russia has ranged from saying that Zelensky is not a legitimate ruler. Remember, Russia has said we need to have the phrase they have used is denazification of Ukraine. But in effect, what they want is a veto on Ukrainian political choices, right? The Russians need to say, listen, we're declaring Zelensky, who's worth noting a practicing Jewish leader, he is actually a Nazi, but the Russians are saying anyone we don't like is actually a Nazi. And so what we need to do is have veto power over any candidates that come up for election, over the political leadership. And that would effectively grant Vladimir Putin control over the Ukrainian political system. And so, right, there's all of these stances that have shown up in Russian negotiations. They're always changing, right? Remember, a year and a half ago, Russia wanted just a buffer zone. They were afraid of having NATO troops on their border. But even in these negotiations, where they're granted a buffer zone, right? The U.S. says, okay, we'll grant you recognition of these occupied territories, a literal buffer between you and Ukraine. Russia still says, well, actually, you can't have NATO troops on the other side of the buffer zone. And they say, well, what the hell, man? Like, I thought it was about not having NATO troops on your border. Also worth pointing out that NATO troops have been on Russia's border for 20 years, since the Baltics joined NATO in 2004. So the Europeans continue to believe that there's some sort of stable U.S. and Russian stance, and there just isn't, right? The Russians have lied. Remember the Easter truce from literally 3 days ago, right? Vladimir Putin, absolutely a lie, right? Russian forces continued offensive operations across the front line. Vladimir Putin's energy infrastructure ceasefire, absolutely a lie, continued to strike targets deep inside Ukraine, continued to strike infrastructure targets, and yet somehow even when he has opportunities to make small, partial good faith agreements, Vladimir Putin has shown an overwhelming desire to absolutely dump on them. And that is, I think, the fundamental problem here, is that negotiating with Vladimir Putin, he is not someone who negotiates credibly. What he believes he is doing in this, to him, negotiations, international agreements, those are staged, managed events to appease the public, and that the real negotiation is the force, is the battlefield. So he is operating as though the U.S. and Europe are performatively surrendering. That's what he thinks is happening right now. They're engaging in what he feels is a performance in which they will eventually capitulate to the Russians, but only after a sufficient symbolic fight, right? That's just how, again, that's how Russian politics works. That's a version of how Soviet politics worked. And so for Vladimir Putin, he just believes that's really the case. He doesn't think he's negotiating with sincere negotiators. And the issue is that this is not how, I mean, fundamentally, right? This is someone who wants to win via force and feels he can win via force. He's to Vladimir Putin, he's never been closer to total victory. Right? He might actually be able to get concessions that he never even dreamed were possible. The ability to force NATO to check, to withdraw, to gain a veto power over NATO membership, things that were only fantasies for him. And what I want to point out, this sort of dual peace plan system, this isn't the only evidence that I have that Ukraine is giving the White House the finger, right? And before we talk about sort of why and how, I wanted to mention, of course, guys, that that as a guy, the older you get, the busier you get. I get it. I run a business. I drop 7 days a week. I put out videos on this channel. I have one kid, another on the way. We are so busy, and I still find time to work out. I still find time to get it done. Just finished an Ironman a few weeks ago, and if you are one of the guys like that, you know exactly why I do it. You know exactly why we do it, right? It means, staying up later. It means working out on your lunch break. It means waking up earlier. It means not wasting your time. But I created Strike Gum for you guys, and you know already why you need it. It's got 90 milligrams caffeine. That's as much as an Amp Energy, as much as a Red Bull, but 0 sugar, so there's no sugar crash. But the appeal is the package. Listen, this fits in my pocket on long training rides. This fits in my gym bag. It fits in my glove box. It goes where I go. So instead of having to go all the way to the gas station, drop $5, buy a Red Bull or whatever, I choose Strike Gum. I get the energy surge I need, and I get it done. If that's you, and you know it, if you're part of that 1% of guys that are like that, go to strikegum.com, pick some up, right? Go to the store, get the 5-pack. That's your best bet. Subscribe, because I see, right, 50 over now in the last month, over 50% of people who have purchased Strike Gum are repeat customers. The proof is in the pudding. So don't rip yourselves off. Get the subscribe and save, right? Subscribe, get it cheaper, get it once a month. It's going to change. It's going to change your whole workouts. You're going to have so much more energy and focus. It's totally worth it. It's a no-brainer. Okay. And the link is in the description. Okay. Here's the other evidence that I have that Ukraine is basically tired of the US's BS. One is that Trump is seething because he says Zelensky hasn't signed the very important rare earths deal with the United States. This is a deal that most people agree is basically a colonial extraction deal in which the United States is going to take possession effectively of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Again, in exchange, essentially, as the president has stated, in exchange for what the Ukrainians were told was aid, was a gift. Again, it's sending the Ukrainians a bill for their Christmas presents. It's kind of fucked up. And the problem, though, is that why should the Ukrainians sign it? That's the thing to ask yourselves. The U.S. has already said we're going to negotiate a deal with Russia that contains none of the terms that you want, that are acceptable to you. It's going to offer no punishments to Russia. There is no provision in the U.S. deal for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And the United States has said there's going to be no more aid to Ukraine no matter what happens. And they've actually said that if the Russians don't agree to this peace deal, the United States is going to walk away entirely, right? Meaning that they're going to leave Ukraine to its devices. So there's really no reason for Russia to agree to this deal, and therefore no reason for Ukraine to agree to this larger peace deal. And so when the United States is bullying, coercing, screaming at you, why on earth would you sign an overwhelmingly favorable agreement with them? It doesn't make any sense. Like, remember, when Trump rolled out his tariffs, Ukraine was tariffed. Only Russia was not tariffed. And so again, all of this is a message that the Ukrainians are finally starting to get, which is that the United States is kind of a dirtbag ally, right? We can't be counted on. We are working really to give Russia a victory simply because Russia asked for it. And why, if someone has no leverage over you because they are unhelpful in every way, shape, and form and working against you, why would you help them? And so in all likelihood, the Ukrainians are simply saying, listen, we've done the math. That's my thesis. We have a new strategy that is highly efficient, right? The war is not even about artillery anymore. Artillery is not efficient enough. It's drones, it's drone pilots. That's how we're fighting and winning this war. And we think we can continue to contain Russia. As others have pointed out, at the current pace of advance, Russia is a mere 80 years away from Kiev. And I think the Ukrainians are simply saying, listen, America, we did the math. We don't need you. Yeah, it's going to be a little tougher. We're going to have to finagle some stuff, but the Europeans will ramp up their ability to produce defense materials. They're going to contribute probably more significantly. And we think we can sustain this fight against Russia for years to come, right? So I want to point out a couple of things. Why? Why is it so important to the U.S. to let Ukraine get fucked, to let the Russians seize territory and then get it recognized? That's one of the questions that everyone's kind of asking themselves. But the answer is pretty clear. The answer is President Trump appears to be jealous of Vladimir Putin. Trump has said, I'm really not trolling about making Canada the 51st state. Now, I want to point out an important fact. Canada's government has said, we will never be the 51st state. So therefore, the only way to annex Canada, to conquer Canada, is to use military force, right? And what I want to point out is that normally, for decades, since really the Second World War, the rule has been big countries can't just conquer smaller countries and take them over. But if Putin can roll into Ukraine, annex territory, and they say, great, this is ours now, and the international community goes, great, looks like yours now, congratulations on winning, right? And then you have the, but what does that do? That creates a new international norm. And that international norm allows President Trump to achieve some of his own objectives, like conquering our ally, Canada, right? And, right, this is also true of Greenland. Trump has said about acquiring Greenland, an autonomous territory under Denmark, another ally. Danish leaders have said you can't do that. President Trump said, quote, with Greenland, just listen to this quote. He says, quote, they would be very well off if they, and then he pauses, I think it's important for us for national security and even international security. And so Trump appears to initially say, well, this isn't about the U.S.'s safety. This is about making Greenland great, a part of the United States. They'd be well off with us. And this idea that you can conquer your neighbors if you want to has to be legitimized. And I think Trump is looking and saying, well, I can legitimize this behavior if I stamp Vladimir Putin's willingness to do it, right? Then he says, all I need is permission from China to do it, right? The other global superpower, nuclear power especially. And he says, well, if the Chinese, you might remember, have their own designs. They want Taiwan. They want the Spratlys. They want a number of other sovereign countries' sovereign territory. And they don't because there's a sense that the international community will not accept those actions. But there's a problem, a really fundamental problem, which is that, well, that's changing. And if Trump normalizes it, what you have instead is a sort of unspoken agreement where they say, listen, if you're big, if you're strong and you want to conquer your neighbors, all the other big and strong guys who have their own designs on their own neighbors, they say, let's all just agree. Let's all just agree to stay out of each other's way for a while and we'll just conquer our neighbors. The problem, of course, is that historically when that's happened, right, what that results in is a path to conflict, and the two superpowers tend to collide pretty viciously again and again and again in some pretty brutal wars. Historically, this has resulted in some of the most brutal wars in all of history. But ultimately, that is a problem for someone else, right? Trump in his administration. In fact, Trump being an 80-year-old man probably wouldn't live to see a conflict between a true war between the U.S. and China. And again, he's so committed to not having wars that if you're China, this is the day and age to take Taiwan. You're never going to have a more passive United States and a more accommodating United States, especially if, again, China goes, man, we're really busy taking over Taiwan. Don't worry, we don't really have time to look into what happens to Canada or Greenland, you know? So, yeah, this is a troubling direction for the globe to go. And I don't know what's going to happen, but, I'll be here. I'll keep you guys informed as best I can. Now, there's a couple other stories that I think are interesting, right? But I wanted to cover specifically more troubling info about old Pete Hegseth. And apparently, he was like, I'm the Secretary of Defense. I don't need to follow those annoying operational security things. Those things where, my internet traffic has to be secure. He said he actually has instructed the Pentagon to set up a Normie internet line right into his office and then put the Signal app on his personal computer so that he can conduct official U.S. policymaking business on an unsecure line on his personal laptop. Literally just put, you put Netflix on one tab and you put top secret plans to strike the Houthis in the other, and he sees no problem. Why would you not, guys? Who doesn't love watching the Joe Rogan Experience on a big fucking, in HD? You can really, you can see the smoke from the cigar. You can see the ice cubes in his whiskey glass. And then on the other screen, you have, top secret satellite photos of Houthi bases. So just absolutely unhinged, right? And again, this is just a commercial internet line, guys. A commercial internet line. I don't even know what to tell you, right? 3 computers at Hegseth's desk, a personal computer, another for classified information, and a third for sensitive defense information. But no one is supposed to have them inside the secretary's office because, like, oh my God, I can't even explain it. Your personal computer, guys. Remember, I need you guys to understand that the security risks that you and I face as normal people, spammers and scammers, that sort of thing. But if you're the Secretary of Defense, every hostile or even semi-hostile country wants access, the closest access they can get to you, because it's going to tell them information that they cannot get anywhere else. It's why the U.S. was able to for years keep Ukraine one step ahead of the Russians, because in all likelihood, the United States works tirelessly to get access to the Kremlin's highest levels of meetings. And they do that not just with human sources, but they do it with technical information, right? They do it through technical means. And that includes getting personal computers and personal phones and turning them into listening devices. It's not advanced. It's not that hard. And the fact that Pete Hegseth took essentially was a personal computer, something that was probably loaded with foreign countries' spyware, and just set it right next to a classified computer is insane. But it's just absolutely preposterous, right? And here's the thing, guys. Part of the reason, there's some evidence that the secretary may already be compromised. Because look, there have been, right, seven Reaper drones shot down in the last couple of weeks. Nearly $250 million of Reaper drones have been taken out by the Houthis. This is so bizarre, including 3 in the last week. Somehow, mysteriously, the militants' ability to target drones over Yemen has improved dramatically, right? The drones were either doing attack runs or conducting surveillance, and they crashed both into the water and onto land. Which, guys, it's almost like the Houthis know somehow, or really like the Iranians know where the drones are going to be. It's almost like they know where the operations are going to take place. Now, it could be it doesn't necessarily mean that it came from the Secretary of Defense or a compromised system around him. But it is interesting that he leaked specific details about operations against the Houthis. And in turn, the Houthis become more effective at shooting down surveillance aircraft, at blinding the United States. Now, it could be simply that the Iranians received Russian technology. The Russians have had a generational leap forward in terms of their electronic warfare systems, their ability to conduct jamming, their ability to spoof drones. So certainly it's possible that this was just unrelated. The Houthis might have some sort of portable radar system that lets them see the drones because they're not especially radar sensitive or radar stealthy. But, the fact is that the Houthis can do this, says that for some reason, somehow, they have more information about Reaper flight paths than they have ever had before. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Please hit that subscribe button. That does make a difference, right? Thanks to James Gerling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, Jay Zola, and Henry Roussier, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.